organizers for letting me or asking me having this talk. And this talk is a COVID-related talk, which is very relevant, of course. But my background is actually in indoor air quality and exposure and health in buildings, not directly COVID or viral transmission related work. But our community has been extremely active in this area the past year and a half, including some of my very close colleagues. So I think I'll be able to tell you a couple of interesting things on the development of our understanding of transmission of COVID-19 in buildings. And I'm going to start with a general background on what viruses are, and viruses are nothing else but basically a certain type of particles. So they have their physical size, they have their physical and chemical characteristics, and they spread the same way as other particles of a different of a certain size. And viruses are here in the 0.01 to maybe, well, certainly below 1 micrometer size. And as you see, bacteria are larger, and then you have other things like flying ash and sand are really large particles. But we also have much smaller particles, which are called ultrafine particles, everything below 100 nanometers, 0.1 micrometer. So viruses they fall in this size range of very small particles, which can easily penetrate the respiratory tract and act differently in the air, which I will come back to. So this is the generally accepted model of deposition in the respiratory system of particles, and it's a matter of size, and of course here we have the percentage of deposited fraction. And if you look at the nasopharyngeal, this is the upper respiratory tract. So basically the head area, the upper head and mouth and nose area, that's where the large ones are mainly deposited, 1 micrometer and above. And they cannot make the turns in our respiratory system to get lower. Then we have the bronchial, which is the pathways between the mouth, the upper respiratory system, and the lungs. And that's where the very small ones are actually deposited mostly. And that's because they are all the time moving with Brownian motion, and they get stuck on the mucous membrane, and they also don't make it lower. But then there is this alveolar region, the lungs. And those are, again, these ultrafine particles below 0.1 micrometer, the smallest the really small particles that can make it all the way to the lungs. And this is important in the way of understanding how viruses work. And the big difference between these particles that I just mentioned, which can come from when you are cooking and burning candles, or from traffic, from diesel exhaust or car exhaust, the difference is that where viruses are coming from the human body, they come in the form of droplets. So they're fluid droplets, and they're bigger, but not always bigger. They have a size between about 1 micrometer and up to 100 and even bigger. But what we tend to forget is that within very short time, a fraction of a second, these droplets can lose their volume. They can dry to 20–30% of their size and volume. And what's left is droplet nuclei. And this is the center, which is basically the virus itself, which is much smaller and lighter and can travel in the air. And here are some examples of how particles of different size can stay in the air without falling. And large particles can fall within seconds and in very short distance from the source. But smaller the particle, the larger, the longer time it will remain in air. That means airborne, which means they will basically stay aerosols. Aerosols are particles that are remaining in the air and are able to be transported by air. And this is where it becomes interesting when we talk about COVID-19. The modes of transmission that we understand and were suspected from the beginning of the outbreak was that from the source, they can travel directly to the person that is very close to the source person. Then there is this close contact through surfaces, contaminated surfaces, which we call fomite. So transmission through fomite is through contact surfaces. And then we have the other size of particles and aerosols that are emitted. One is the coarse particles, which are much smaller than the droplets, but still large enough. And then there are these very tiny ones, the fine aerosols, which can then contaminate a much bigger area. And what was not really understood in the beginning is what role these very fine aerosols can play in transmission in terms of contaminating the area beyond this 1.5 or 2 meters social distancing. And our society, the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, it's about 250 scientists that signed this paper that was published early last year, where we advocated for not only research but recognition of airborne transmission of COVID-19, or at least the possibility of that. And this was an uphill battle because WHO, from the very early days, said that this is not airborne. Everybody who says it's a transmission through air is wrong, and it's basically fake news. And be very careful where you read about credible information about the virus and its spread. And it's all transmitted through touch and close contact and surface contact. So a little bit of a history where this goes back to, this whole fear of any airborne contamination and airborne transmission. It goes back about 150, 200 years, actually a lot more, when the miasma theory was the main theory of transmission, which was actually through air. Decomposed materials, swamp smells, bad smell, bad air was the cause of disease. And that goes back thousands of years, but about 150 to 200 years ago, the germ theory appeared. So microbiology, microorganisms, and for that theory, it was also an uphill battle because nobody really wanted to take it seriously, that there are these microorganisms that might cause disease. One example was Semmelweis, also called Ignaz, like our Ignaz today, who advocated for hand washing because he proved in several very interesting experiments already in the mid-19th century that the number of cases of childbed fever and death at giving birth can be significantly reduced just by washing hands. He was rejected, he was ridiculed, he was beaten. He died after being beaten because of his theories. He had to move from the Grand Vienna, where he did all his work, back to his home in Budapest. And even today, we call Semmelweis reflex, the tendency to reject new information if it conflicts with established views. And COVID-19 started with established views. And that's the exact opposite of what this slide says, because then came a couple of other scientists. Charles Chapin was one of them in 1910, who started advocating for this germ theory very heavily. It made a lot of sense, but until that time, almost everything was caused by airborne transmission, even malaria and cholera, which we today know that is not the case. So he really advocated that it's really surface contact, it's really microbiology, it's spray-borne droplets that cause diseases, and that was overdriven so much that the entire world believed that this new theory is explaining all transmission. And until the 60s, until tuberculosis was proven to be airborne again, this theory did not lose its strength. And basically, it prevails until today that generally the airborne transmission is always questioned because of its history. And we believe, and this theory has been, this whole history has been summarized in these two excellent papers that you see in blue there, why WHO made this early mistake. Probably partly because of lack of understanding of history, but it's also about limited resources. Although we had already from the past 20 years a lot of data on influenza transmission, but of course there are differences between the two. There is also very likely power games and between different WHO committees, and not to lose face. Once we say, big organization like WHO says, well, it's airborne, how can we say a few months later that we were wrong? And of course, there are also other examples or possible explanations. For example, CFD simulations, how CO2 and exhaled breath is behaving in the air, and the breathing zone air movement work that does show that within 1.5 meters, the air from the mouth is dispersed. But of course, it has to be understood in a much more profound basis how viruses work. And there's another paper summarizing very nicely the 6 myths that we believed in the early days of COVID-19, and this is now basically debunked. And the first of them is that aerosols are droplets with a diameter of 5 micrometer or less, which means particles that can remain in air for a longer time and spread through air must be below 5 micrometer. And this is wrong. There are smaller, but there are also larger ones that can stay in the air. And nobody really knows where this 5 micrometer number is coming from. It's a mythical number that doesn't really have a scientific evidence for. Myth 2, all particles larger than 2 micrometer will fall within about 1 to 2 meters of the source. Again, wrong, because aerosols can be even larger particles. If it is short range, it cannot be airborne. Again, the same thing. You can have airborne transmission even within the very short distance. It's not only the droplets that are falling on the surface and then through surface touch or direct contact. If the basic reproductive number, R0, which is the number of infections you cause by one infected person, is larger than for measles, which is airborne and is very is spreading very easily, then it cannot be airborne. And again, it's the wrong understanding of R0, the reproductive number. The reproductive number only says how many get sick from one sick person. It says nothing about the mode of transmission. So you can have actually, you can infect others and have an R0, even if it's not transmitted by air, for example, anthrax. So there is an R0, and you have a person-to-person contamination and a relatively significant transmission. You can also have so R0, and you can also have R0 and have airborne transmission, which has been shown in many cases. 5A and 5B both are about the protection, how masks work, and again, a lot of misinformation that if it is airborne, then masks will not work because they only work for large particles. Well, it's the general filter theory. Air filters is the same. So you put something in front of the particle, depending on the size, some will be more effective, some less effective, and they work for certain sizes differently than for other sizes, but there are 3-4 main modes of capturing particles by a fibrous filter. Impaction, which directly hits the fibers, or again the Brownian motion, which basically makes them stick on the fiber and not release them. But masks generally work for airborne or airborne particles and aerosols. That's the whole idea of ventilation filters as well. And then myth 6, unless it grows in tissue culture, it's not infectious. Again, totally wrong. Actually, specifically in COVID-19, it's extremely difficult to get it actually cultured on a petri dish or anywhere else. No, it's not a fungi, but viruses are difficult to culture, but they can be very infectious. So there is a mounting evidence to support that COVID-19 can be transferred through inhalation and the airborne mode. And finally, WHO early this year, a year into the whole pandemic, decided that there is enough evidence that they should update their recommendations from just offering or recommending hand hygiene and social distancing and masks towards ventilation and air quality. And there is this now in most countries recommendation list to also ventilate and keep the air clean. And there were this year 2 papers in Science by some of my colleagues and friends in the field published exactly on this, and Science has accepted. The first paper which we submitted to Science was not accepted. That's the one where 250 of us signed that letter to start recognizing the airborne transmission. And then a year later, Science published these two papers clearly showing that the airborne transmission of infectious viruses, including COVID-19, is a pathway. And there are more and more studies now coming, which basically clearly review the data from restaurants and meatpacking places, cruise ships, different places, and conclude that there is almost no evidence for fomite, so surface and droplet transmission, and most of the transmission probably occurs through aerosols. One of the studies from Singapore actually tested the generation of viruses by infected patients, and they concluded that 94% of COVID-19 viral copies were emitted by talking and singing, not by breathing. So they looked at just simple breathing, talking, and singing into this machine that you see here, and what number of viral copies are generated, and most of them were coming from talking and singing, and 85% of these were actually smaller than 5 micrometer, so in the aerosol and in the range where they can travel long distances in the air. Another study from Guangzhou in China, where a restaurant outbreak was monitored, very, very detailed. This is the set of the restaurant. You can see here, this is the pink person was the infected person, and he, the source person, and he infected several people, about 8-9 people in this part of the restaurant, but not elsewhere. And this study looked back at about 40,000 close contacts and 13,000 surface contacts, and analyzed in great detail the ventilation flow in the restaurant, and concluded these are here the ventilations, local recirculation ventilation, so no fresh air, that was only coming from here, some exhaust ventilation here, but otherwise recirculation and filtration ventilation locally, and again very clear that these three places were ventilated with one system, and there was a larger outbreak, and nobody else in the other tables got ill, and there was absolutely no evidence after all this analysis of tens of thousands of close contacts and surface contacts. There was no evidence of transmission through contact, and very clear evidence of transmission through the ventilation system and airflows. So I just want to say a few words on this slide, and I'm almost done. This is a new study that came out very recently on the effect of ventilation, and here you see distance from the infected source, 1.5 meters. By 1.5 meters, the concentration of viruses will go down, of course, but depending on the ventilation, it may remain low or high throughout the air beyond this 1.5 meters, because of the size distribution, because of the role of ventilation. And on this slide here, on this figure on the left, this is the probability of infection and the number of new cases in a space with exactly the same occupant density. It's always about 2.2 square meters per person, and the same ventilation rate per square meter. But you have different sizes of rooms and different occupancy. So the bigger room and the larger number of people will have a lower risk of getting infected. But of course, because there are more people in the room, there will be a higher number of infected cases. But the probability of infection per person is basically going down, even though the ventilation is exactly the same. So this paper is advocating for a new look at ventilation, and it's not ventilation per person, but ventilation per infected person. The more infected people you have, the higher amount of fresh air you need to protect the others. And a general ventilation related interventions. So the CDC in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control, already since 2015, they have this this infection control pyramid. And the first and most effective recommendation is always eliminate the source, eliminate the pathogen. The next one is actually engineering controls. So how to control the pathogen. Then it's administrative, influence people's behavior, and finally some protective equipment like masks, gloves, and depending on the situation. So engineering controls are extremely important. Ventilation is one of them. Air cleaning is one of them. It's really having a lot of fresh air, clean the air with good filtration. Very often buildings are running on recirculation systems, so there is a lot of air that is taken through the ventilation system and pushed back into the room. That's not recommended when you have these sources inside, unless you have extremely good filtration in the system, HEPA filter, which can remove almost 100% of the particles. But otherwise, recirculation should be avoided. And if there is no other way, then portable air cleaners can also, with effective filters, could also be helpful. But there is a general understanding now that COVID-19 can be also an indoor air problem and needs that kind of attention, which about a year ago was totally rejected. And with that, I conclude my talk, and I hope I convinced you that COVID-19 is transmitted not only by contact and surfaces, and that it's something that has a very strong scientific background that has been changing over the past year or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel.